Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video, and in this video, I'm back talking about the Life is Strange series once again, where we are nearing the 5-year anniversary of Life is Strange 2, the last full-fledged Life is Strange game I haven't done a full retrospective of, so I'll obviously be doing a video of that. However, when creating that video, I decided, you know what, why not also just talk about the awesome adventures of Captain Spirit. So here, I'll be doing a retrospective of that game as well. Obviously, a spin-off slash tech demo of Life is Strange 2, essentially being this free teaser for the game that was clearly used as a marketing tool, essentially to give this free barrier of entry to the series, and clearly uses the gameplay systems of Life is Strange 2 and has a story taking place before the events of Life is Strange 2. And for what it is, I think it's actually kind of good, where it's a nice, short, focused experience, which can be enjoyed as both a newcomer and a fan, really fulfilling its overall purpose. Through that, obviously comes off as very different than the previous Life is Strange games, where it is the first game in the series that didn't focus on Arcadia Bay or the characters of Max or Chloe, but instead following a minor character from episode 2 of Life is Strange 2 and Chris Erickson, a kid that befriends Sean and Daniel in the main game. Obviously, this came out before the main game, but again, ends up being a nice little episode here focused on showing Chris's background, which straight up is mostly superfluous to the core narrative of Life is Strange 2, however, does add a lot more complexity to the characters that we see in that game. Though, I will say a minor criticism I have of it after the fact is that it is very clear that this was written after Life is Strange 2, where I think you can clearly tell when playing Life is Strange 2 that more complexity was given to these characters for Captain Spirit itself than what occurred during the original development of 2, as some of the darker themes that are implied in this game don't really translate to the main game, and even beyond that, just the overall narrative of this game just feels largely unimportant to the actual events of Life is Strange 2, which is also criticism. But either way, I'll still be talking about my thoughts on the entirety of the game. Again, a very short game, but the game does start off on a snowy day in Beaver Creek, Oregon, with indie folk music playing in the background, which very much fits in with the overall Life is Strange series. But here we do instantly see Chris playing with his toys, making it look like he's using his powers to lift them up, when in reality it's his imagination, obviously being this major insight into his character off the bat. But our first bit of gameplay here is us having to design a costume for his pretend superhero alter ego, Captain Spirit, with us getting some options along the way. Though beyond this, we then get to explore his bedroom, where you can obviously play with his toys, and in typical Life is Strange fashion, obviously just look at the things around his room to where you obviously hear his inner thoughts about them, really playing into the themes of nostalgia that the original Life is Strange handled extremely well, in a way that I think this game actually handles better than Life is Strange 2. This bringing you back to the simplicity of your childhood and the level of imagination that you would have had back then, where in many ways this game can be looked at as a childhood simulator. Though the interesting thing about this game is the fact that it's not just that. It later transitions into having these themes of escapism once the narrative takes a more serious turn, which adds more complexity to the overall story told here. But eventually we do get called to the kitchen by his dad, Charles, to eat breakfast, which allows for the introduction of one of the new systems introduced for Life is Strange 2, that being their ability to respond to dialogue mid-gameplay, which is for the most part just kind of a minor change. Just again, a cool addition here, but nothing that is too integral to the overall experience. It obviously does allow for you to also just choose not responding at all, which is obviously rarely an option in the games before this. But anyway, once getting to the kitchen, Charles' initial reaction to you can be different based on how long you took to leave, where he obviously gets annoyed if you took too long. This is where we do get introduced to the more dark undertones of the story, where we instantly see Charles drinking beer at the table, and also proceeds to ask Chris about the bruise on his arm, obviously implying the fact that Charles is alcoholic, while also implying the fact that he physically abuses Chris when drunk, which is obviously this massive negative turn for the story here. This really dark, serious topic that's trying to be handled here in a game that, outside of that, largely feels like you're playing as this kid that has this grand imagination, though obviously they take that theme and connected to the theme of escapism in a way that really satisfies the story here, where we obviously do learn about the death of Chris's mother, Emily, which had sent his father down a downward spiral, with Chris still struggling to deal with it himself, obviously being this character piece on how the death of a loved one ends up affecting their family, with this also being a reveal that his imagination is really a way for him to escape from the harsh realities of his real life, which in essence is kind of just a very meta theme for the story here, considering obviously the concept of the video games is typically looked at as escapism for most people. But again, I do like that it takes this happy-go-lucky story and then adds more complexity to what you would have expected from it. But either way, we do see the conversation transition to getting a Christmas tree, which we obviously later see in the events of Life is Strange 2. Though really, when Charles isn't drunk, we do see him coming off as a loving single father, which really makes a lot of their relationship even more tragic. The fact that he has succumbed to his alcoholism to where it puts a strain on this relationship that otherwise would have been a very loving one. And really, I do feel like the dialogue in this game ends up coming off a lot stronger than that of the original game. Mind you, the original game was written strangely, where there's a lot of like weird pop cultural references or slang terms being used. While I do feel like the dialogue in this game and in Life is Strange 2, for whatever it's worth, does mostly come off as more natural, and I feel like that's something I instantly noticed the first time I played this game. Though at this point, this is where the game finally opens up, as Charles wants to watch the basketball game that's currently running, which ends up taking 23 minutes to conclude, all while having whiskey in his hand, which obviously characterizes him once again. Though tells Chris to wake him up when the game is over if he falls asleep, which makes you question why is he so dedicated to watching the game if he thinks he's gonna fall asleep to it. But this then allows us to explore the area more freely here, which just in general, this entire game is a very open one that can be easily finished if you just wait out the 23 minutes for the game to end and then talk to Charles at the end, and it just concludes the story right there, which makes speedruns extremely funny in this game, as most of it is just simply waiting. However, the true way you're meant to play the game is through completing these objectives, where Chris is given a list of tasks, dubbed My Awesome Things to Do, which essentially gives you a list of quests to complete. They all have Chris taking the moniker of Captain Spirit and it being the true objectives for this game, despite the fact that they are completely optional for completing the game. So they all do a very effective job at characterizing Chris, adding more complexity to his character, but also adding more nuance to the overall themes of the story here. Though, again, the fact that these are optional is something that I do find a bit strange, as I've literally found myself accidentally finishing the game before, or obviously if you don't know that talking to Charles after 23 minutes is up, at least to the end of the game, you can literally just accidentally finish the game when you don't intend to, which is kind of a minor annoying aspect of all of it. But again, it does leave this game very open, to where it very much feels like this small sandbox for you to recreate the experience of having a childhood weekend morning that, again, I do think adds this level of nostalgia that this series really thrived itself on up to this point. Anyway, let's run through the quests themselves. I mean, quest 1 has you building your Captain Spirit costume, to which you need to explore the open world to find a cape, your armor, and also a helmet or mask, which is obviously an objective here that incentivizes exploration, which I do think is a nice way that this game is designed. The fact that if you do want to complete these objectives, you essentially need to interact with every place of interest on the map, which I think is a nice subtle way of the developers pointing you towards every interactable object here. But the cape we do end up finding in Chris's closet, while the headwear you can make in a number of ways. You can make a helmet using foil in the kitchen, or you can make a mask using the Halloween makeup that you find in the bathroom, both of which obviously very much showing his imagination coming into play there, while the armor can also be built in a number of ways as well. I mean, light armor can be found in the sports bag in your dad's room, while otherwise the heavy armor is made with a cardboard box that you find outside in your dad's car, which was a box used for beer, which once again characterizes Charles as an alcoholic, which obviously adds more dark undertones to the story here, in that Chris is making use of these items that propel Charles' addiction in order to escape from his actual reality. Though it is while you're in his dad's room that you can find some documents revealing that Charles is still on the hunt for his mother's killer, with her having been killed in a hit-and-run accident, obviously still characterizing him as struck with guilt over her death, while also showing that he is actually dating someone and hiding her from Chris, though remains unwilling to commit to her, which fully shows you how broken of a man Charles still is here. Though also here you can learn more about Emily, reading through documents around the house that fully outline the entire family history between Emily and Charles' relationship, and also Chris's love of his mother, and how supportive Emily was of Chris, which obviously plays into the grief he's still dealing with. By the way, this objective isn't completed just yet. You still have to paint the parts, which to do so you have to go into the garage, needing to find the garage key on the door near the kitchen. Though once doing so, you end up wearing wearing your Captain Spirit outfit, with a lot of the later quests having you pretending to be Captain Spirit as you take down some of Captain Spirit's nemesis, like in the second quest, that being Defeat the Water Eater, which really shows Chris's imagination here as he enters the boiler room, with it being extremely dark, during which he ends up imagining the water here as a monster that he has to defeat, giving us an initial look at how he faces off against his inner fears. But after that, we get some lighthearted quests like Mustard Party 2, which involves us breaking into Charles's phone to play a mobile game for some reason, and also for some reason the pin ends up being the numbers that spell out hot dog, which is stupid, as obviously to reference the hot dog man from the original Life is Strange. However, also, why does a grown man have hot dog spell HAWTDAWG as his password? But either way, this leads to us being able to play a minigame on his phone. Again, pretty superfluous there. Next quest is Mantroid and his super villains, which has us just playing around with some of Chris's toys. Or through these, we are given some choices on how to treat the villains, like killing them or forgiving them. We can choose to save civilians over stopping the villains. And again, there's choices like this that, again, don't really play that much of a factor, though are nice little moments to give our own interpretation of Chris's character there. So again, this ends up being another mission, though, that does incentivize exploration, where again, these are around the open world, with some being in his room, some being in the living room, and then one in particular is in his treehouse outside, which brings us into the next quest, that being finding the secret treasure, which has you having to find a map and a decoder, the decoder being in his treehouse, which he has to use his superpowers to open the cabinet on your left, which again is an additional type of interaction in this game that really just plays into Chris's overall imagination. Though once finding the decoder, you then return to his room where you find the map and line up the images to find the treasure location. Though it's also in the treehouse where you can find a letter to Charles that came from another parent at Chris's school, revealing that Chris had gotten in a fight at school defending him, and revealing that Chris had been bullied, something he is hiding from Charles, along with the fact that you can also light a cigarette while you're in the treehouse, which all this feels like this more rebellious turn for Chris here, obviously showing him still struggling, now without a proper role model in his life. By the way, the map ends up leading us to the Maze of Doom, aka a junk pile in the backyard. But here you have to crawl through it, and using the instructions on the map, it allows you to exit through the other side, to which you find his treasure, that being photos of his mom, which once again just shows how much Chris cared about his mom and how much she truly meant to him, which is nice characterization for him. Now, the next quest involves you practicing his targeting skills, which has you collecting beer cans around the kitchen and setting up a shooting range and hitting all the beer cans. Again, once again showing Chris using these items related to Charles's alcoholism as a way to play into his escapism here. But following this, we get back to the superhero-based objectives in defeating Snowmancer, who is a snowman. But this has us going to the garage to where we need to open the locker, to which the password ends up being 2005, the year Chris's father won the basketball championship, which is a really lame password, but once again characterizes Charles as someone kind of hung up on his glory days. Well, once again, inside, you do find more letters related to Chris's mom, including a nice little callback to a letter from Principal Wells from Blackwell Academy, which it mentions that Emily was an alumni of and talks about her supporting their art program. A really nice, pretty superfluous callback there. And through that, there are some other series references across this game. I mean, there's a Mark Jefferson book that you can find on the bookshelf. There's also a newspaper article on the dinner table that refers to the death of Sean and Daniel's dad, which we obviously see those events in Life is Strange 2. But the main objective here is to find the firecracker that's inside the locker, which you use to confront Snowmancer, again, a snowman, and blow up its face using the firecrackers, because I guess that's the way to kill him. But this ends up taking us to the final quest, that being finding Mantroid on his planet, which involves us having to take a spaceship to get there, which is what Chris imagines his dad's truck to be, meaning that we have to find his car keys, which are on the ground in the living room, and in turn get into the truck, to where Chris ends up imagining this taking him to a Mars-like planet, where as we walk along, we hear the voice of Mantroid mocking him, up to the point where we arrive at an intersection clearly supposed to be mirroring that of the one where his mother died. And this makes it obviously very clear that Mantroid is essentially the personification of his mother's death and the role it has on his state of mind, being this great final quest here, showing us this true demon that haunts Chris to this day, and him being unable to defeat it by the end, him being knocked out by it and waking up back in the real world, essentially showing how crippling his guilt here is on him, to where he does show guilt over his mother's death, with it being implied that his mother had died, having gone out to get him a Christmas gift, also partially explaining the strained relationship between Chris and Charles. But either way, with that and all the quests concluded, we can then return back to Charles waking him up after the basketball game, or after getting him up, Charles then falls over twice, clearly drunk, and proceeds to start swearing and yelling at Chris. Now it's obviously being able to see the more abusive tendencies of Charles here. But outside we hear their neighbor and Claire hearing the commotion and ringing the doorbell, with Claire obviously being the grandma of the Diaz's in Life is Strange 2. And here we have Chris answering the door, where we are given numerous options here that do affect how Claire responds to this, though really none of this ends up mattering, as none of this is really followed up on in Life is Strange 2. But here we can either tell her the truth or lie to her. Now by telling her the truth or getting caught in a lie leads to Claire knowing that Chris has been abused, though instead of trying to take him away from his dad and protect him, she decides to leave and then say she's going to have a serious talk with his dad, which seems kind of dumb if you actually think that he's being abused, to not seemingly do something more immediate. However, also you can lie here, which I do think is probably the outcome that I personally prefer. I do think it further plays into this complex dynamic between Chris and Charles, showing Chris's still love for his father and wanting to protect him, which plays into that previous letter we had seen and him getting into a fight with his school bully over his father, but also still playing into these darker themes of Chris choosing to support his abuser, which I think is how you would expect a child to react in this situation, especially when there's the risk of getting their only remaining parent in trouble. By the way, your lie here can be successful, to which Claire will just suspect nothing is wrong and instead invite Chris to play with Sean and Daniel, though there is a way for her to be suspicious of your lie, which usually these are done through having done some of these other optional objectives that involve some of these red flags, like having taken out the beer cans, or using the firecrackers, or shoveling the snow, or probably most obviously the smoking, which will make him smell like smoke. Though I will say some of these are actually kind of stupid in the fact that shoveling the steps is kind of just a basic chore, to where her response to this is saying that you shouldn't be doing chores, you should be playing because you're a kid, which it does feel kind of dumb. That wouldn't you expect the kid to do some chores? But also, she also calls him out for the firecrackers, which is literally him playing as a kid, which is what she kind of wanted him to do. So again, it does feel like some of these kind of conflict with each other, but no matter what, Claire ends up leaving here, and it ends up not really playing that much of a factor into much. But this does lead to Charles yelling at Chris once again and ending up blaming him for Emily's death, which does feel very tropey, but again does add to the tragic nature of all this. But strangely, we do have Charles like immediately apologizing for this, which I do find a bit strange, as again the implication is that it's Charles's alcoholism that causes him to lash out at Chris, though I feel like for him to immediately recognize that what he did was wrong kind of nullifies that to a degree, and the fact that it makes him seem a lot more conscious while drunk. But this obviously leads to Chris being upset and running away to his treehouse, obviously this way for him to escape, which takes us to the final scene as he climbs up the ladder, only for one of the boards to break, to where as he falls, he is saved from him hovering above the ground. Which obviously the implication at this point is the fact that maybe Chris actually has superpowers and that he was able to save himself through hovering here, though obviously we later find out in Life is Strange 2 that that's simply not the case, as alluded by the fact that the ending of this game is us noticing that Sean and Daniel are watching him from the other yard and end up waving to him, being a nice conclusion to this game, being this point that directly connects back to Life is Strange 2, while also introducing the characters of Life is Strange 2 and also giving a lot more depth to the character of Chris in the situation that he was just in. Mind you, it's a situation that, again, I don't think they do much with in the actual Life is Strange 2, where that's kind of my biggest criticism of this game in general, is the fact that obviously it's supposed to lead into Life is Strange 2, though very little of it actually does, with again, it very clearly feeling like it was written after the fact, though obviously it was released beforehand. That doesn't feel like it fully connects, even though it does on paper. But either way, I mean, this just through and through is a pretty nice little tech demo that introduces us the concepts of Life is Strange 2, while also being this character study of this 9-year-old struggling with the ramifications of his mother's death. it's a game that I definitely grew a lot of respect for on my latest replay, where I think there's a lot more depth to the way this game is designed in retrospect than I had thought in my first couple playthroughs I did right when the game came out. However, at the end of the day, it's still a relatively short story, one that doesn't really have much time to really excel beyond its initial concept, but as a side story, and one that, again, was released for free and is clearly just this game released to market the actual game of Life is Strange 2. Again, it's way better than it has every right to be. It is a actually solid experience that tackles some pretty dark themes, though something that, again, I think just struggles to really have that lasting of an impact solely due to how short of an experience it is. But either way, with that, those are my thoughts on the awesome adventures of Captain Spirit. Now, as I mentioned before, I made this video because I'm intending on making a retrospective of Life is Strange 2, which should be the video coming out after this, which is obviously the last Life is Strange game I haven't done an individual video for, so stay tuned for that. But for now, that's the video. Thank you for watching.